Welcome to the Afghan Eye YouTube channel. If this is your first visit, make sure to subscribe and press the notification bell so that you won't miss any of our new videos. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to episode 22 of the Afghan Eye podcast. I am Sangar Paikar, your host, and today my guest is none other than Ahmed-Waleed Kakar, who has a bachelor's degree in politics and history from Brunel University in London, and he obtained his master's degree in world history from King's College in London. Ahmed-Waleed Kakar is also the founder of Afghan Eye. So Ahmed-Waleed Kakar, welcome to the Afghan Eye podcast.
Thank you very much, Sangar, first of all, thank you for introducing me so well onto the podcast. Thank you for having me on the podcast. It's an honor to join the podcast on which you're such a brilliant host. Thank you very much, and salam alaikum to you and to all of the viewers, listeners, and everyone else.
So, Ahmed-Waleed Kakar, my dear friend, this unusual introduction of this podcast is due to the fact that I think it was the 28th of March when the article was published.
Yeah.
So on the 28th of March, an article appeared on the website of Afghan Eye about the Durand Line. And this article has been read thousands of times, and it has been shared widely. And today we realize that this article, our most recent work, is the most read article on our website. So plenty of reasons to talk about the article, and that's also why today I'm going to interview Ahmed-Waleed Kakar, because while the article is very long, very elaborate, and very detailed, there are other aspects that need to be discussed, and there is also some critique of the article, and we are going to address the critique as well. So first of all, we will do a brief summary of the article, and then we will address the critique and the implications of this article. I will start off by asking you, Waleed, for people who don't know, can you explain what is the Durand Line and what is the Durand Agreement?
Okay, so the Durand Line was a line drawn by a man called Sir Mortimer Durand, who was a representative of the British Indian government. And that line was drawn to demarcate or to delineate the spheres of influence of British India and Afghanistan, respectively. That line now functions effectively as the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. To this day, it remains, at least officially, unrecognized by successive Afghan governments. No Afghan government since 1947 has recognized the line as a legitimate border in any official capacity. And the Durand Agreement was the agreement that led to the delineation and the demarcation of the line. And the Durand Agreement took place in 1893 between Sir Mortimer Durand, after whom the line is named, on the one hand, who was representing the British government, and Amir Abdul Rahman Khan, on the other hand, who was the Amir of Afghanistan at the time. And that agreement, once again, was signed to delineate the respective boundaries or the spheres of influence of the two parties. Because prior to that, Amir Abdul Rahman Khan had come into power in 1880, and a lot of territory remained undefined. So the status of those territories, they were known as Yagistan, as we would know it in Afghanistan, or sort of land of rebels or independent territories, or territories where sort of different tribes exercised varying degrees of independence and sovereignty over their own affairs. And because there was sort of a competition between British India and Amir Abdul Rahman over those tribes, to have influence over those tribes. Eventually, it was agreed that these zones needed to be demarcated, and that the successive tribes and the areas which they inhabited needed to be defined properly.
Okay. Speaking of tribes along the Durand Line, you are from the illustrious Kakar tribe. So can you maybe explain what is the relation of your own tribe with the Durand Line?
Okay, so the Durand Line, one of the things that I alluded to it earlier, the successive Afghan governments, at least officially, have never recognized the line as a legitimate border. And one of the reasons that's been articulated is this has separated brother from brother and cousin from cousin. And so whilst that sounds like quite boring political rhetoric, there is quite a strong element of truth to that. So on my maternal side, I'm also a Kakar. Pashtuns are patrilineally organized. So I'm Kakar by virtue of my father being Kakar and his family being Kakar. But I'll start off with my mother's side. My mother's side are also Kakar. They're Musakhil Kakar. And Musakhil are, to varying extents, seen as independent, and they're mentioned independently of the larger tribe. And my ancestor was a man called Mullah Babar Musakhil, who migrated from Kakaristan, Job to be specific, to Kandahar in the reign of Ahmad Shah Durrani. And similarly, on my paternal side, I'm from the Sangar clan of Kakars, and they too migrated from what is Kakaristan around the Job area during the reign of Ahmad Shah's son, Timur Shah Durrani. And they migrated because a select group of tribes from what's known as the Loy Kandahar region were given land and whatever north of Kabul to the east of Kabul when Timur Shah transferred the capital from Kandahar to Kabul. So Sangar Kakars, our sort of colony that migrated from Kakaristan, are sort of in the Shamali area, and they're also in Desabs. So it shows that according to the Durand Line now, I'm ancestrally Pakistani. Okay,
that explains a lot.
And the thing is that's not unusual, because a lot of people that are now Pakistani citizens are ancestrally Afghan citizens, and a lot of people that are Afghan citizens are all ancestrally Pakistani, and also a lot of people came from Bukhara and Samarkand and Tajikistan and whatever. So the modern borders that have sort of been imposed, the Durand Line being the most prominent amongst them, really show that the region is very interconnected. We sort of, in my village, it's very known where we came from and how we got to where we are. And so the Durand Line, just in one instance, just my family or my village's example, is one example of a tribe that's sort of been cut into two separate states that has to swear allegiance to two different states. But more so than the Kakar, you have tribes like Atakzi, you have Nurzi, you have Momand, you have Wazir, you have Momand, you have Shinwari, there are Yusufzai to a lesser extent. So it's not just my tribe that inhabit both sides of the border, but there are actual tribes like the ones that I mentioned whose actual ancestral territory is cut in half, that didn't migrate anywhere like my ancestors did, for example, that were where they were until Sir Mortimer Durand and Abdul Rahman signed this agreement. What about you, Sangar? Do you have any sort of... are you also ancestrally a Pakistani like I am?
No, not really. Before I talk about my tribal background and my family, just I wanted to point out that Dr. Faiz Mohammad Zaland, Kabul University lecturer, has recently published an article on world, what's it called? Yeah, politicstoday.com. It's an article about the current situation of tribes who live on both sides of the Durand Line. So guys who have read Ahmed-Waleed Kakar's article, or people who are going to read the article, I suggest you also take a look at the article of Zalan. With regards to my own background, so I am a Ghalji, Ahmadzai. So the Ghalji are one of the biggest tribes who are on this side, on the Afghanistan side of the Durand
Probably
Line.
the biggest. Probably the biggest, yeah.
Yeah, and most Ghalji are basically pastoralists who have settled in recent time. Like I'm from the Ahmadzai branch of the Ghalji, and the Ahmadzi are a branch of Sulaiman Khel. So the bigger tribe is Sulaiman Khel, but just like Musa Khel are seen as a separate entity of Kakar, so is the Ahmadzi seen as a separate entity, but they are the Ahmadzi are actually from the lineage of Sulaiman. In the past, before the occupation of India by the British Empire, our ancestors used to travel all the way across northern India to Myanmar and back and forth. So boundaries didn't exist, and pastoralists, people who owned lots of cattle, they could freely move around. But since the advent of colonial regimes in those areas, our ancestors, they were forced to settle permanently. And so that's why I don't have any relations with people on the other side of the border like you do. However, on my mother's side, I am a Tajik. And my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, and his father, they were very famous watchmakers in Kabul.
Okay.
Like in the past, everybody knew who they were. Like they were very famous in Kabul. And my maternal grandfather, he used to travel a lot to India, and then later to Pakistan, etc. And he had many friends from the other side of the Durand Line. And his most famous friend was Awal Mir, the singer.
The guy who is the founder of Afghanistan's de facto national anthem.
Yeah, he used to sing a lot of very nationalist songs like Watan Janat Nishan De Gulan Pake Karama. So he was a very close friend of my grandfather. So whenever he was in Kabul, he would hang around with my grandfather. And from that side of my family, I have always heard that people didn't really recognize that he was from a different country. And
that to be fair, that exists to a large extent even today. I have many friends that are from Pakhtunkhwa and whatever, and there's never really the sense that we're a different people from a different country. So I can only imagine it was much more back in those days.
And after the start of the war, like the after Soviet occupation, many people from my paternal side, the Ahmadzi, they're from rural areas of Afghanistan. They were forced to flee and settle in refugee camps in Pakistan. And most of my friends that I have, people, from different branches of my tribe, are people who are actually born in Pakistan, in Peshawar, in Haripur, in all those areas. And they are obviously children of Afghan refugees. Mm-hmm. But so I have this sense that we all have these cross-boundary relations with people. And this is also an important point that this is why I asked about your tribe as well, because obviously we can have a very cold-hearted discussion about politics and borders and everything. But the personal aspect of it is important because we're talking about a line that has cut across a region where people live on both sides. They have the same culture, same language, same common history. So this is why this article is also very important. Now, my next question for you is, can you explain why did you take it upon yourself to write this article?
For the same reason I've written all of my other articles. I'm dissatisfied. People are probably going to think this guy's always dissatisfied, but that is to a large extent true. I was dissatisfied with the way in which the Durand Line is being talked about. And the Durand Line is obviously not something that sort of happened in a historical vacuum where its effects or its effects are no longer relevant, or the line is no longer relevant. But there's sort of the historical aspect of the Durand Line, and there's the contemporary aspect. There are, as you know, almost everyone knows, movements in Afghanistan and Pakistan that are a large part of their talking points are about being against the Durand Line or whatever. Those are political issues and political statements. And so if you dabble in the contemporary side of things, it's a political issue you're getting into, and that wasn't what I was too interested in doing. However, the history of the Durand Line itself, by virtue of ongoing developments, has become politicized. And what I was seeing was too much of inductive approaches to history rather than deductive. And I view history as an academic discipline, obviously very highly, because I got a master's in it. You were saying something?
Can you maybe explain what is the difference between deduction and induction?
Okay, sure, yeah. So it's a lot of lughat parani, as we would say in Kabul, right? So I view history as an as a deductive discipline, right? And I obviously view history in very high regard. Now, let me start off with deductive. Deductive means that in conducting a certain experiment or body of research, or in trying to achieve a certain conclusion, a certain result, you rely upon the data, the research, the sort of all of the experiments you have done. I'm trying to be as vague as possible here because obviously there's scientific aspect to this, but you rely on the basis of your research, you formulate your conclusion. Okay, you formulate the final result. So we can say deductively that when you put 2 and you add another 2 to it, it becomes 4. Okay. Inductive reasoning, however, is the total opposite. Inductive reasoning is when you use your own personal biases and prejudices, as we all have, by the way. I have mine, you have yours. That's part of being human being. That's the human condition. You use your own preconceived conclusions and prejudices to color how you see that body of research. So rather than saying, what is the research telling me? You say, which facts can I pick that actually help the veracity of the story that I'm trying to tell here? Which facts do I need to ignore in order to tell this story and to make the conclusion work? So if I am, for whatever reason, convinced that 2 + 2 is 5, I try to manufacture a way in which I gain that conclusion. And so the Durand Line itself, the discussions on it are dominated by people on both camps that want to prove their version of history through the selected bits that they like. And this is obviously something that's very human. It's done by people that studied history as an academic discipline. But more worryingly, it's done by people that don't actually have that sort of qualification in history. It's done by people that are sort of history enthusiasts, we could say. And so there was a thread that was, you asked me why I wrote this article. Why did I take it upon myself to write this article? It started off with a thread on Twitter. Okay, it started off with a thread on Twitter.
Well, what do you know?
What do you know? But this thread got thousands of likes. It was widely shared. It was sort of praised as being insightful, great, whatever. And it went to the extent of even being shared by a news organization, a very famous news organization in Pakistan. And what this thread did was it sort of just made a couple of claims, provided references. This is my narrative. Boom, right? But anyone with a discerning mind will tell you that's not actually how things work. You don't just pick out certain things slap a reference on top and, you know, as we would say, Bismillah, Allahu Akbar, it's finished, right? It's not how things work. And so I wrote a brief rebuttal thread to that thread, basically debunking some of the claims that were made. But on Twitter, you can't get too deep. I'm sure you're aware, Sangar, you know, there's the other camp, there's your camp. You can write whatever load of bile you want. Your camp will just be pressing the like button, and they can write whatever they want.
Are you accusing me of something?
No. But the point is that you can't really get too deep on Twitter in terms of a serious discussion, because it's a public platform, and a public platform, it's like having a debate on the street, for example. And so there's also the character count. So then I thought, you know what? Because so many people messaged me or replied to my thread saying, wow, thank you, I didn't know this. Alhamdulillah that we have historians like you, whatever. And then I thought, you know, what I've provided is a very surface level dissection of the initial thread. And I need to go a lot deeper into this, because you can summarize something, but I'm looking to go a lot deeper into it. And that is why I took it upon myself to write the thread. To write the article.
Okay. Yeah, the article is also a very long thread.
Yeah.
Yeah, so with regards to deduction and induction, this really reminds me, sort of short sidetrack, this reminds me of when I was a student. During my bachelor's degree, we were going through different courses in research methodology, philosophy of science, etc. And while I was doing those courses at the university, I was also attending classes in tafsir of Quran and ulum al-hadith and all these other courses. And we would also notice that while there is a orthodox teaching of Islam, there are also heterodox teachings, and there are revisionist movements, modernist movements.
Yeah.
And I realized that the orthodox way is also the way you describe it. Like, for instance, when in any of these different disciplines in Islamic studies, etc., from a orthodox perspective, what they do is they gather all the narrations, all the statements, all the ahadith and everything that they have, and based on a very elaborate research, then they arrive at a conclusion, and that's how those old classical books are compiled. But when we see how religion is being discussed today, you see the same problem. Is that people cherry pick stuff from different sources to prove a point, and then it's unavoidable that you always stumble on this kind of problems. It's not just in history, but obviously in study of Islam and other matters as well. So I think, you know, it's very valuable to publish this kind of articles, which I endorse it. I like it. I was really excited when you started writing it. But yeah, so I have another...
Were you expecting it to be as long as it ended up being?
No. See, personally, I would say that I tend to like longer articles. Mm-hmm. Because we have the freedom to write whatever we want on Afghan Eye. There is no limitation. We don't have to limit it to a certain number of words. And the longer the article, the more freedom you have to really dissect a certain topic. Mm-hmm. So I wasn't really surprised when I saw your draft and I saw how long it is. I was actually quite pleased. But yeah, so there's this other question that I have for you, which you sort of alluded to already. See, there are very popular websites, there are social media pages, as the one you mentioned, that the one that was even shared by a Pakistani news channel. There are famous TV personalities. All of them comment on history. History is something everybody has an opinion on, and they all discuss history at length. But you actually explained why it's important to, talk about history in a more academic way. But don't you think that the way the article is written, that it's maybe not very suitable for a layman, because as much as we may not like it, most people are accustomed to the very popular inductive way of history telling. So would you say that maybe this article is not suitable for those people who like the popular way of history telling?
That's a really good question. It's a complicated one because I took that into account when I was writing the article in terms of sort of the way that I structured the article. It was sort of a bread and butter breakdown of what's being said, why is that, let's say, wrong. I'll demonstrate to you why it's wrong, and walk you through it, and then a piece of analysis on the basis of my walkthrough. And yeah, I do agree to a large extent. A lot of people are going to not be particularly inclined towards reading 6,000 words. But I think there are two broad categorizations that in fact, that we can make. There are firstly those who are just due to no flaw of their own, they're just bombarded with the inductive sound bites, the mudslinging, and they want to know more. Okay, they have questions. They've heard or they've seen a certain reference for certain things that have happened, and did that really happen, or how did that happen, and oh my God, why did it happen, right? And my article is written for people like that. Okay, so for those that are interested, that the ones that have a certain level of exposure, my article is written for people like that, as well as those who may be actually, in their own academic disciplines, very accomplished, or they may, they may have some, but they haven't actually been exposed to a thorough retelling of the history. In terms of those that just want history so they can call other people names, and say mean things to people and whatever, only God can help them. My article is not for them, quite frankly. If your whole purpose behind reading history is to counter a certain narrative or to promote a certain narrative, my article isn't for you, because I remember when I was first writing it, I wrote on Twitter as well that this article will not gain me any friends from either side of the ideological spectrum, and that's fine, because there are loads of people that write for those guys. I'm not one of them. I'm for the guys in the middle. And so perhaps, the style of writing is a bit complex and whatever. That is a criticism I'm willing to countenance. But I did endeavor to try to make it accessible to as many people as possible. And those who aren't interested in an actual factual breakdown, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help them.
Yeah, so basically, وَمَا عَلَيْنَا إِلَّا الْبَلَاغُ الْمُبِينُ.
There we go.
Yeah, okay. So the next question that I have for you is that you have obviously tackled certain issues in this article. So can you explain what are those issues that you try to tackle?
Yeah, so I mentioned in the live stream as well, before we had the live stream, by the way, it was fantastic. We got loads of people watching and asking questions. But I mentioned in the live stream that there are sort of different issues that I'm trying to tackle in this article. And so one of the issues that I've always faced is that people that are seen as conventionally being bad, they can be bad, right? That's but if we're trying to rationalize and explain why bad people do certain things, that doesn't make you someone that necessarily agrees with them or likes them or is apologizing for them. For example, we can say Hitler killed 6 million Jews. Evil man. Totally not someone that you want your kids to end up like. Why did he kill 6 million Jews? Because he had a certain vision of what he wanted, a very twisted vision of what he wanted Germany to be. Now, in saying that, you and I are not neo-Nazis or apologists for Hitler, because he'd probably send us to the gas chambers as well. So there are numerous issues that in the article that I'm trying to tackle. One of them is this idea that the amirs of Afghanistan, these Mohammadzai amirs, the image that's been projected in the popular history and the inductive history is that essentially there was sort of an auction in which these guys just sold off their land and their territory and their subjects to the British Empire, which is totally false. There's another issue, and this is more prevalent. The one that I just mentioned is more prevalent in Pakistan, but it's also in Afghanistan. The second issue, and this is more prevalent in Afghanistan, but also in Pakistan, because there are overlaps ideologically on both sides, is that this agreement, the Durand Agreement, was only supposed to last for 100 years, which is totally false. And I guess I'll get to that later on. And the third issue that I sort of have, and this is sort of on a more analytical perspective of how states interact with each other, international relations, is what I see as this really naive reliance on these naive, nice, cute, fluffy concepts of international law, of international conventions and international norms. And I say that somewhat more on the realist camp of international relations, and I mean all respect to those on the different camps, but I'm not buying that that narrative of how states interact with each other, especially because we're Afghans, right? We're Afghans. We have seen how international law has been instrumentalized to perpetuate war and occupation in our country. We have seen international law flagrantly abused with no repercussions, or we've just seen it be demonstrated as totally irrelevant in the operations of certain states or their militaries in our country or in the vicinity. So forgive me, but I don't really have much of a faith or a strong belief in how states working based on international law. It's not how I see the world. And those are the three main issues of the article that I'd say I tried to tackle: the naive reliance on international law, this idea that just land was sold and the British Empire came along and said, 6 lakh rupees for Pshin, and the Afghan Emir said, great, going 6,000 once, twice, 3 times, and the idea that it was only supposed to last for 100 years. Those are the three primary issues that I tried to tackle.
Now, with regards to the first issue, you said that there is a misconception that Mohammadzai rulers basically auctioned their land and their territory to the highest bidder. Now, you obviously explained in the article that it was much more complicated. But would you say that the fact that you are rationalizing the decisions, the things that, for example, Amir Abdul Rahman Khan has done, that's somehow a defense of Amir Abdul Rahman Khan, or that you're being sympathetic to Amir Abdul Rahman Khan?
Well, no, I wouldn't. And, based purely on my family background, my ancestor in 1880, when Amir Abdul, and I mentioned this in the article, and I referenced my family oral history, that when Amir Abdul Rahman annexed Kandahar, he massacred the local sort of scholarly elite. One of the people in that scholarly elite was one of my ancestors, called, on my Musa Khail side, called Mullah Abdul Rahim Kakar, who was the personal tutor to the Crown Prince.
Yeah, go ahead.
So my ancestor Mullah Abdul Rahim Kakar was the personal tutor to the Crown Prince of Afghanistan under Sher Ali. He had a place in Bala Isar. Amir Abdul Rahman beheaded him with his own sword personally in what we in Kandahar known as the Kharqeh Sharif, where he'd taken refuge. On my paternal side, I had an ancestor called Muhammad Najib Khan. In Shamali, they know they don't say Muhammad, they say Ma. Okay, so Ma Najib Khan, but Muhammad Najib Khan, who was advisor to Sher Ali, who was loyal to Sher Ali to the very end, was deported to India by Amir Abdul Rahman, because when all of the nobles of Shamali, when Amir Abdul Rahman was coming from Bukhara, from the north of Afghanistan to Kabul, the nobles of places like Kohistan, like Kapisar, like Parwan were all going to pledge their allegiance to Amir Abdul Rahman. My ancestor didn't do that and was thus deported to India. Okay, so my own family history with Abdul Rahman is not the best, and therefore I'm the least inclined to viewing Abdul Rahman in a positive light. But my family experience does not account for all of Afghanistan. You see, I may have my own preconceived prejudices against Abdul Rahman, but that should not stop me from rationalizing why he did certain things. As terrible as they were, or as deceitful or as treacherous as they were, in his mind, they had a certain rationale.
Yeah, this is also an important point. What we actually trying to achieve here at the Afghan Eye is that when we talk about politics, whether it's the current government, the Taliban, the United States, or other actors as well, we have to be able to explain certain things, even if those particular explanations are very controversial and very, that you can actually get in trouble saying those things now to a lesser degree. But in the past, for instance, like I do not shy away from saying that Afghanistan is an occupied country. Mm-hmm. And by saying that, obviously, I am going against the dominant narrative, but I can explain why it's so. We have had podcasts here with former U.S. Soldiers who said the same thing. Mm-hmm. We have had articles, we have had many discussions where we explained that. And so that's why, that's one of the criticisms that I noticed being leveled against you. Is like, okay, basically this guy is defending Amir Abdul Rahman Khan. So that's why I asked that question.
It's just, as much as you hate Abdul Rahman, right? Fair enough. I'm not going to be martyred on the hill of defending Abdul Rahman Khan. Trust me, that's not what I would want to do. But as much as you hate him, should not blind you to the fact that what he did, in his mind, he did it for a reason. Yeah. And if you're not willing to acknowledge that, then you're not really someone to be having a debate with, to be brutally honest. And so, yeah, I wouldn't say I'm being sympathetic to Abdul Rahman, but explaining how and why certain things happened.
Yeah. Okay, so that was one of the criticism, but we will have a lot of criticism, so prepare yourself. There is another question that I wanted to ask. Can you say what was the most important finding during your research? Because you spent 3 months researching this article.
So you can imagine, right, Sangar? This article was 6,000 words. There were loads of things that I found out that were interesting, but that weren't strictly speaking relevant to the article. Loads of interesting things that I guess I'll share at some other time on Twitter or whatever. But what I kind of had a vague idea of issues pertinent to the Durand Line, of the different tribes, whatever, based on my master's dissertation, okay? But however, what I found is that really and truly how much British relations with different tribes varied on a case-by-case basis. And that is something that I was vaguely aware of. To some extent, thanks to my master's dissertations, but really how much sort of the British tried to co-opt certain tribes to make sort of their life easier. Sort of the differences in the sort of the erratic shifts in their policy, the extent to which Abdul Rahman tried to play a double game with the British, which is actually it's an accusation that's leveled at Pakistan since 2001. And I think there's a very simple reason why weaker states play double games against stronger states, and that is that they don't want to openly defy those states out of fear, but at the same time they're also very keenly aware of their own long-term interests, and they want to sort of hedge their bets. And to see that Abdul Rahman was doing that is something that I found very interesting. So there were loads of findings, some of which were not actually strictly speaking relevant to the article. There was another one, for example, I mentioned it briefly in the article, where the Prime Minister Mohammed Hashim Khan viewed the Afridi tribe as very suspiciously as being too close with Hindu nationalists. Okay, and if we consider the rhetoric of today, in which the current Afghan government is accused by people of being too friendly with Hindu nationalists, which isn't sort of a baseless claim, that's very interesting. I also found out that in the 1930s, the government of Nadir Khan actually implicitly threatened war against British India because British India could not contain sort of tribesmen from Waziristan coming into Afghanistan and causing trouble and whatever in Khost and in Paktian and regions like that. And once again, that goes against sort of this notion that wholesale being a puppet kind of thing. History is much more vast than that. There's a lot of gray area that a lot of people can't seem to wrap their heads around.
Yeah, and in the article you also mentioned that I keep confusing the names of those guys. The Pakistani leader who was a commander in Waziristan during the independence of
President Ayub Khan. For example, there's this notion that the signing of the Durand Line was like this. And obviously, this is how nationalism and ideologies and grand narratives of history work with, betrayal, trust, love, like the Cinderella kind of stories where Amir Abdul Rahman signing this agreement up until 1947, the Afghan tribes on the other side of the Durand Line were like just fighting against the British non-stop. Whereas I pointed out, actually, that's not what happened. It was much more complex than that. And President Ayub Khan, who's seen in Pakistan very favorably, he's one of the most popular presidents. He was a Pashtun. On the eve of Pakistani independence, he was fighting, commanding a whole brigade in Waziristan. Before that, he was in Luarga, or Landi Kotal, as it's known as well. So this is a guy fighting in the British Indian Army on behalf of the British Crown, who is an Afghan by descent and by ethnicity, fighting against fellow Afghans. So things aren't really as black and white. So the grand stories and it doesn't really work like that, does it?
Yeah. I have some more questions about that later on. So the other question that I wanted to ask is, so before we end the sort of the summary of the article, what is your conclusion in the article? What you obviously you've covered so many things, but what is the conclusion?
The conclusion of my article is that the controversies of the Durand Line. So first of all, there were a number of different... So the three main issues that I had, to explain those very briefly, the Durand Line was not intended to serve as a 100-year agreement. Simple as. What many people will be shocked to hear, though, is that it was actually meant to serve less than that. So it was an agreement signed between a ruler and the representatives of another state that was pending renewal upon change of ruler. Number one. Number two, the idea that land was sold or auctioned off and subjects were sold. Afghan emirs had been receiving cash and weaponry from the British to solidify their state way before any land was ceded to Britain, which shows that the receipt of ammunition, weapons, and money was not something that was, strictly speaking, tied to the cessions of land. It was actually something prior that had happened prior to that and continued. Number three, these notions of international law, whatever, are totally baseless and false. The Durand Line is about power, and both states inheriting a paradigm from the British, trying to enhance their power at each other's expense. And in that context, the Durand Line being about power, the whole paradigm is obsolete because the circumstances in which the Durand Line came about as a legal geopolitical reality, those circumstances are no longer there. And so the Durand Line itself is obsolete. It's a relic of a past that has long gone by. Those were the main conclusions.
Now, if you say that the Durand Line is now obsolete, that's quite a statement. Now, before we move on, there's something that came up in my mind. You see, there are people still convinced that the agreement was for 100 years. Now, this view is very dominant among Afghans. I've heard this many times. In fact, I have heard this. This is a very popular myth about the demise of Dr. Najibullah. They say that in 1996, when the Taliban took over Kabul, a delegation from ISI came to Kabul. They took Dr. Najibullah out of the United Nations compound in Kabul, and they forced him to wear a uniform and sign an agreement seceding the other side of Durand Line to Pakistan, because in 1993, the agreement was basically null and valid. And in 1996, he was still considered as the legitimate ruler of Afghanistan. And that's why they forced him to sign the agreement. But he said, no, never. I will never sign this agreement. And then they killed him. And that's the story. And then apparently they killed him. And then they took off his uniform and put on the kamis partuk, the one that he was wearing while he was hanging from the traffic boot in the picture you have seen, yes. Obviously. So they say that's why they killed him, and basically Pakistan sent the Taliban to take over Afghanistan for this reason. Are these people aware that even the Taliban never recognized the Durand Line? Yeah, yeah, that's a very interesting point. So the Taliban never recognized the Durand Line. But you have studied the agreement, and are you sure there is no mentioning of 100 years in there?
Let me put it this way. You know when you're on Microsoft Word and you write something and you make your writing white colored so it doesn't show, unless the British slid something in white coloring that camouflaged it in the paper, I have not read anything that suggests it's 100 years. So unless the writing's invisible or it's like a UV pen where you need to get it to decipher the code, no, it wasn't 100 years.
In all the 3 months of your research, you have never come across any evidence that this agreement was for 100 years?
I have not.
No. Are you 100% sure?
I am.
Okay. Oh, okay.
It's a good question because it needed to be asked repeatedly, given how widespread this myth is, and it's so widespread that politicians can't even counter it out loud. And to some extent, we will take the slack for the politicians. We'll be called Pakistani agents instead of them. So I guess maybe it may become easier for them now.
Yeah. So okay, now this point is very important because, like for instance, here in the Netherlands and Germany, there are a lot of people who worked for the Najib government, and they all believe this. I have had this discussion with so many people, okay? And they all claim that this particular aspect of the agreement is written in the original document, and that's why the original document is hidden and nobody has access to it, because they don't want people to read that it was only for 100 years and that basically that was...
You know, there's something very interesting that I came across, and it was in Mohammed Hassan Kakar's book, and that was that there is no signature that he could find during his research of the agreement being signed by Abdul Rahman in the Persian language. That is, he basically said that something to that effect, that Abdul Rahman didn't sign a Persian, the agreement in the Persian language. But now here's my point. Let's assume that's true. Okay? Does it matter? No. Because even if let's say that's true, and that Abdul Rahman was blindsided and he was fooled into signing this, fine. Does it matter? No. Because, and this is tied to what I said in the article, those areas that Abdul Rahman ceded to British India are not in Pakistan because of the text of the agreement. They're in Pakistan because Pakistan can hold them. Okay? Because Pakistan possesses the raw military power that's necessary to hold those territories, to govern those territories, to administer whichever verb you want to use, whilst Afghanistan simply can't. And so that is an argument that you could make. So I would say to these Najib people, okay, to these pro-Najib people that you've had the fortune of speaking to, what I would say is fine, okay? 100 years was the extent to which Abdul Rahman agreed to give these territories. Does it matter now? No. No, it doesn't, does it? And that's a very bitter pill to swallow, right? For a lot of people, it's a very bitter pill to swallow. It's a very no-nonsense approach that some people will not like, or I'll probably get accused of undermining international law or law as a discipline. To all of my lawyers out there, I'm sorry about that, but that, you know, can anyone really disagree with me? Let's say that the agreement was for 100 years. Let's say that Abdul Rahman never signed the agreement in the Persian language. Does it matter? Would it change anything on the ground? I would say it doesn't. And I leave the judgment to everyone else.
Yes, and I think that's also important to drive this point home, is that the same thing applies to Kashmir. Kashmir is occupied by India, while Pakistan may be more powerful than the current Afghan government in being able to hold those territories. Pakistan is not more powerful than India, and this is also the reason why they cannot liberate Kashmir.
Or it's also the reason, I mean, for example, we look at the Bangladesh war, okay? There were a lot of Pakistani loyalists in Bangladesh. Did it matter? It didn't, because Pakistan could not exercise the level of I mean, there were the atrocities and everything, of course, but in terms of exercising the prerequisite level of military power to hold what was East Pakistan, it couldn't do it. Simple as. And it's a bitter way to look at the world. But like I said, we're from a part of the world. We've been sort of exposed to this all of our lives where, and I said this in the article, I'm quoting myself, I hope I don't do injustice, might in an inherently imperfect world that was created to be imperfect is right. How many places have populations that want to exercise their self-determination and are refused? Too many to name. And we could do hundreds of podcasts exploring each of those different territories, and we still wouldn't do justice to them. So this idea that and this goes both ways, by the way, Sangar. If we look at the Afghan side, and one claim that's often made is that Pashtuns on the other side of the Durand Line in Pakistan are unhappy, and they're being oppressed by Punjab and the Pakistani army, and that Afghanistan should liberate them. And to that I say, Let's assume that the Pashtuns of Pakistan are unhappy. Can we do anything about it? We can't, right? We just quite simply can't do it. And so self-determination for me comes a very distant second to the ability of a power to hold or govern whichever territories.
Yes, this issue of might makes right is something that I think most people who are interested in politics, history, international affairs, and law, they need to realize that the statement here in this context is not a normative statement. If you study Plato's Republic, in a Republic there is a segment, there is a discussion where they talk about this issue. I think I can't really pronounce his name. I don't know how it is pronounced in English. I think it's Thrasymachus. He is the one who is the character in Plato's Republic who says might makes right. But when we talk about might makes right now, it is seen as, okay, you are basically saying the one who's powerful, whatever he does is just, that's justice. That's not the argument. The argument is when you study behavior of human beings and governments, that's basically the essence of it. The one who holds more power does whatever he or she or it...
Right of conquest, as they say.
Yes, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it is just. It doesn't mean that it's good, but that's the way it is.
And I mentioned in the article as well, the same thing could be applied to Afghanistan. Hazarajat, speaking of Abdul Rahman, was conquered, annexed, brutalized, not because the people wanted it, of course they didn't, but because Abdul Rahman just quite simply could do it. And similarly, places like Waziristan or other places in Khyber-pakhtunkhwa or Fata, their self-determination, a lot of these tribes and their love of freedom, at the end of the day, quite sadly, didn't matter because they lacked the capacity to free and liberate their territory from the British, who in turn had the capacity to occupy and govern their territory. And so the coin can be flipped both ways repeatedly.
Okay, so we're going to round up the discussion about article before we really dive into the critique. Can you say what was your impression of how the article was perceived? Because it's now the most popular article on our website. Thousands of people have read it, but
I would say that the article itself was received very well, and I was pleased to see that it was received well, not just by Afghans who were messaging me or replying to me saying thank you, this is brilliant, or you've made things make a lot of sense, but it's a lot of people who would probably consider themselves patriotic Pakistanis also appreciated the article. And I think the reason both sides appreciated the article was that it was devoid of the jingoism and the sound bites and the accusations and whatever. And once again, I think one of the comments I received was, it's great because it doesn't focus on who was right and who was wrong. And the reason that it doesn't do that isn't because I'm soulless and I'm a devil. It's because I leave that judgment to the viewer, or to the reader. They can make their judgment as to who was right or who was wrong. That's not really my job to do. What I'm doing is telling you the story and analyzing its relevance in the contemporary age. It's up to the reader to decide who was right, who was wrong, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. But even that is not a mode of history that I'm very fond of purveying. And so the fact that people who identify, or I would consider patriotic Pakistanis, liking it is because it had that level of understanding of how the world really works, of how international relations really play out. And above all, I think it was appreciated the fact that I said that the line itself was obsolete. And what I meant by that wasn't that the line is obsolete, so let's go and conquer Lahore. But rather what was meant by that was that, this paradigm, the last 7 decades of enhancing one's power at the other's expense hasn't really worked for either side. And so maybe we should actually just try to shift the whole overarching structure in which that is what both states have to do in order to increase their power. Instead of increasing their power at another's expense, why not do it symbiotically, which isn't something that's impossible. Yeah, that's. I was very pleased with the reception that I got. It took me aback slightly. I didn't expect it to become the most popular article on the website, because a lot of the other articles have been up for about a year. For example, the article we wrote on the Fatimiyun was written in December, right? The article written on Ahmad Shah Massoud was written on Massoud Day on September the 9th, right? So for this article to overtake those two, which were also read thousands of times, it was pretty, it was an achievement for me.
Yeah, no, that's great, Okay, so now after some praise, now we have to start the critique. I read your article before it was published, and then again when it was published, and I went through all the sources that you've used, and what I noticed that you have used a lot of British sources. Now, one could argue that the British Empire, their officials, all these authors of these documents, they had their own biases, they had their own agenda, and they wanted to obviously push a certain narrative. So your reliance on those sources would mean that, why didn't you use other sources? What's your answer to this?
So I think, first of all, I think that's a really good question. That's a brilliant critique. And as a historian, if you will, it's something that I love to hear. And that's a very valid question. Yeah, I did rely a lot on British sources. And the reason that was that those sources were the ones that were primarily available to me. I relied on a lot of parliamentary papers. And those parliamentary papers were forwarded from the government of India to the British House of Commons to be read by sort of parliamentary committees and whatever. And those parliamentary papers contained a lot of personal, private correspondence. So we're talking about correspondence from Owen Tudor Byrne, who was the private secretary to the Viceroy of India, writing to Lewis Pelly, who was sort of a representative. There's so much correspondence between sort of officers, let's say in Landi Kotal, writing to commanders in Peshawar, or officers in Kabul writing to Peshawar, or even the British representative or ambassador, writing to the Viceroy of India, or Lord Roberts, who after Maiwand had to travel to Kandahar and defeat Ayub Khan to regain sort of British prestige, writing back to the Viceroy. So these, a lot of these sources were private, personal correspondence in which the incentive to purvey a certain narrative would be reduced because they were writing amongst themselves, British officials. But of course, British officials have their own preconceived prejudices. If you read a lot of these private correspondence, you'll see them calling these tribesmen, these Afghan tribesmen, they are noble, yes, but they are savage. They are noble savages and we can civilize them, and they are fanatic Muslims, and they are thieves, and they are, all of these sorts of things are there. And as you have that element to it, but also one of the things with history as a discipline is that it continuously develops. And unfortunately, I don't have access to digital resources in Pashto or in Dari, Afghan sources I'm talking about. Unfortunately, I don't have access to those, which is very sad for me as someone that loves and appreciates history. And so that is a valid criticism, and maybe 10, 20, 30 years down the line, when someone goes and visits the National Archives or the Archiv-e Milli in Kabul, maybe they can expand on this article and add parts to it that perhaps are missing or that require more context. This is something that's a continuously developing field. And so, my reliance on primarily British sources, something, that I completely, I acknowledge. But I would also add in that the people to whom this article was a response, that is, the popular historians, the mudslinging historians, also rely heavily on British sources. They're not relying on Afghan sources either. And so this is, I would love for Afghan sources to be consulted more and for this particular period of history to be viewed increasingly through Afghan sources.
Okay.
Having said that, I have referenced Ahmed-Hassan Kakar, who can be considered the foremost authority in this period of history. There were a couple of others I cannot name off the top of my head. And I also reference Abdul Rahman's own autobiography, which is 2 volumes of self-congratulatory nonsense.
Yes, okay. There is a quote in the article that there's a piece of the article. You said, having once sacrificed his throne for Peshawar, Dost Muhammad now made overtures to his eastern neighbor and new masters of Peshawar, the British. The story of how Peshawar initially fell to the Sikh occupation, this really took me by surprise because if you think about it, it sort of reveals how short-sighted some of our rulers were in those times. Why would they do such thing?
I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. Short-sighted, a greed and a lust for power. I think they were very hawkish because what they considered was that there's a jihad being led by a charismatic religious leader. And that charismatic religious leader was also, you could say, belonged to the age of sort of reformist Sufis. I think he believed to a tariqah, if I'm not mistaken, Sayyid Ahmad Shahid. And he was not just launching a jihad against the Sikhs that was very successful. He was also concerned with reforming and aligning certain culturally Afghan practices with Islam.
Sayyid Ahmad Bareilly, he was one of the forefathers of the Ahlul Hadith movement.
Exactly.
So
Exactly. So the popularity of his jihad actually threatened to undercut sort of the ruler, the governor of Peshawar at the time, who was Muhammad Zay, the ancestor of Zahir Shah, Nadir Shah, Dawood Khan, and that governor of Peshawar allied with local tribes who were obviously the Yusufzai, for example, were a very privileged tribe in the Durrani Empire. Timur Shah Durrani's favorite wife was a Yusufzai. The mother of Shuja and Zaman was a Yusufzai. They were considered Bar Durrani, in fact. So the Durranis, because they share a common ancestor with the Durranis, they were very heavily privileged. And so the governor of Peshawar, primarily with the local Yusufzai tribe, was concerned that this jihad of this Indian Sufi could threaten to undercut our government and support. And so they made a deal with Ranjit Singh. But oftentimes what happens with hawkish measures is they create the same scenario that they were intended to avert. So they thought this will actually help to perpetuate our rule in power. It did the complete opposite. And that is hawkish politics 101. But the other thing, like I said, is that Sayyid Ahmad Shahid or Bareilly, I don't think he was actually part of the Bareilly school, but just from Bareilly in India. But he was concerned with refining these culturally Afghan practices, pre-Islamic, anti-Islamic even, and that raised a lot of resentment amongst people in the Peshawar Valley. So, yeah, I mean, short-sighted opportunism that blew back in everyone's faces, and Peshawar was occupied by the Sikhs.
Okay, there is another quotation, there is another piece of the article that needs to be addressed. You have written that bilateral relations deteriorated in 1873. The 1 million rupees granted in 1873 remained in the Kohat treasury, never to be withdrawn by the prideful Amir. So why did these bilateral relations decline?
Okay, so this was part of the article in which I was explaining the history of grants and subsidies to Kabul. So when Dost Muhammad Khan died in 1863, and after that there was a 5-year civil war between the various sons of Dost Muhammad Khan. So there was Sher Ali Khan, and Sher Ali Khan was picked because he was the son of Dost Muhammad's favorite Popalzai wife. Okay? And this wife had also given Dost Muhammad Wazir Akbar Khan. Okay? So this was sort of the creme de la creme of Dost Muhammad's progeny. But as well as that, there were other sons from different wives. For example, Muhammad Afzal Khan was the son of a Bangash mother, and Muhammad Afzal Khan was the father of Amir Abdul Rahman Khan. So there was a 5-year civil war, after which Sher Ali became the Amir. And what happened in 1873 was that the British and the Russians signed sort of a convention that Afghanistan would remain out of Russian sphere of interest. Okay? But Sher Ali was not consulted about that, which he was pretty angry about. On top of that, what happened was that the British viceroy told Sher Ali's representative that if the Russians attack you, we will probably come to your aid, okay, and that was seen as being not being a very good ally. But the British also told Sher Ali that the Russians will not attack you, but then they also renewed a request that please let us station some of our agents on your northern border so we can monitor Russian movements. And Sher Ali, even prior to becoming Amir, was Anglophobic. He was very paranoid about the British. So he thought, if the Russians aren't going to attack me and they've given you their word, right, why are you then asking to put agents on my borders, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this isn't something that I've sort of, this isn't something that's said in the sources explicitly, but you can make an inference as to why Sher Ali would be so concerned. Like, on the one hand, you're telling me the Russians, after conquering Samarkand and Bukhara, they're not going to come for me, but you also want to monitor them on my borders, whilst also avoiding giving me explicit assurances. So what happened, that was in 1873, bilateral relations declined. In 1876, there was an Ottoman delegation that visited Kabul to Sher Ali to essentially get him to start war against the Russians, because the Ottomans were fighting the Russians at the same time, or they had tensions. And Sher Ali said that if I had the weapons to attack the Russians or the British, I'd actually attack the British because they've encroached on my rights. And what I think he was talking about there was the fact that the British occupied Quetta. Okay? And I referenced in the article as well, the Indian Viceroy's private secretary was saying, we command the Amir from Quetta, because from Quetta, geographically, they're in a favorable position with regard to Kandahar. So this was why bilateral relations declined.
Okay. There is a very juicy piece in the article. I was really laughing when I read it first. It says, a petition to the British from the Bangash and Turi tribes of Quram wrote that their hatred for the Duranis was so visceral that if our flesh and bones and their flesh and bones were boiled together in a pot, the water wouldn't unite. Now,
that's a very Pashtun way of expressing hatred, don't you think?
Yeah, but why did they hate the Duranis so much?
What I would say is that even in Amir Abdul Rahman's time, so this is after this petition, but even after Amir Abdul Rahman, even during Amir Abdul Rahman's time, he used to encourage the neighboring tribes of the Turi to raid their property and villages because they were Shia. Okay? And he also used that to try to increase his influence amongst the attacking tribes. But what happened was that in the reign of Sher Ali Khan, there was a great attempt at sort of centralizing the state, forming the state, taxing people, and these tribes generally were not taxed much. I tried to research a lot into why they hated the Duranis specifically so much. There isn't that much information other than the fact that they considered the Duranis to be oppressive, their blood and bones and our blood and bones won't unite. So I would say that it was based on the fact that they were Shia, and the British sources attest to this, that they feel sort of threatened by their neighbors, but also because they were being taxed, and perhaps because they were Shia, they were being taxed even more by the governments of Dost Muhammad and Sher Ali.
Ah, okay. So, yeah, that would make sense why they hated the Duranis. There is another piece that pops up. You wrote the Durand Agreement ultimately allowed the British, the paymasters of the Afridi, to encroach on their territory, forcing the Afridi to sacrifice their financial well-being for the cherished independence they themselves had jeopardized. They lost both. How did the Afridi jeopardize their independence?
So what the Afridi did was that they inhabit a certain tract of land, and unlike the Shinwari and the Mormant, they're more generally, almost uniformly, on the other side of the Durand Line. But they are and were considered the most powerful tribe in that territory, and the Khyber Pass was seen as their area of operation. And so the Afridi, in facilitating the invasion of Afghanistan by the British, so whilst they were nominally under Kabul's control and Sher Ali was their emir, they were generally in reality independent. And by allowing and opening the floodgates of the British army to invade Afghanistan and occupy Jalalabad and Kabul, that put in place the circumstances in which the British installed Amir Abdul Rahman on the throne. And by putting Amir Abdul Rahman on the throne, who was obviously a ruler that was very reliant on them, they strong-armed him into signing the Durand Agreement. And when the Durand Agreement was signed and these territories are very clearly demarcated and delineated, the British became very bold in governing the tribes very directly, because before this, the tribes saw themselves as lying between British India and Afghanistan, and they would play one off against the other in hopes of preserving their independence and gaining allowances. So in Kabul, we would use the term Dukasai, okay? Yeah. Dukasai, for those that don't know, a kasa means a bowl. So Dukasai means the two bowled, as in someone that likes to eat from two bowls. And what a lot of these tribes would do, in order generally to preserve their independence, but also for the financial benefits, was that they would play off Kabul and India against each other. Okay? But what happened was that the Afridis totally allowed India to overpower Afghanistan, and thus that eroded their independence more than anything else, which eventually they had to rebel against. Despite the financial benefits, they rebelled against it because they cherished their independence more, you could say. But there was no counterweight, because Amir Abdul Rahman at that stage, he refused to help them overtly and directly. He sent some men over and he gave them uniforms and weapons, and he gave them some money, but it wasn't comparable to outright support for their rebellion, and they lost both.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so there is another quote about Amanullah Khan. You wrote, Amanullah Khan is portrayed as an Afghan nationalist icon. This is despite his hurried signing of the Rawalpindi Agreement, leaving the Wazir and the Masood, fellow Afghans who fought valiantly for him at great risk, on the wrong side of the Durand Line and at the mercy of British forward policy. Can you explain that?
Sure. So, Sangar, you're pretty much probably more in tune of domestic Afghan sort of political consciousness than I am. And we noticed that, especially over the last couple of years, there's been a very strong emphasis on how heroic Amanullah Khan was. We did a podcast on him as well. And so Amanullah Khan is seen as heroic, nationalistic, a real champion by the same people generally that view the Durand Line as oppressive, as an agreement that was only meant to last for 100 years. But actually, despite that status he has, if we look at what he did, was that he cowered and signed the agreement because the initial advance of the Afghan army had stalled, and he incited the Wazir and the Massoud, who basically fought for Afghanistan's independence, by the way. Afghanistan's independence was based on their sacrifice to a large extent. Okay? He signed the agreement confirming the Durand Line, leaving them out in the cold at a time when the British were like, no, we're really going to push the Wazir and the Massoud a lot. And this also, you could say, caused problems for Amanullah, because the person who was leading operations in Waziristan had advanced from Khost. His name was General Muhammad Nadir Khan, who became Nadir Shah. Nadir Shah had told all of these Wazir and Massoud leaders, look, don't worry, the British, if the war ends, the British will not punish you, we'll take care of that, and we're also going to try getting you to join Afghanistan. And then Amanullah Khan signed this deal. So he not only left the Wazirs and the Masouds on the other side of the line, and they fought for another 2 years because of a war that Amanullah had encouraged them to start. But also Nadir was kind of, it led to a greater distance between him and Nadir, because Nadir was obviously like, what the hell did you just do here? And Nadir obviously viewed Waziristan as the sort of the first barrier of defense for Afghanistan. And he had very good relations with the Wazirs and the Masouds, which is why they also helped propel him into power. So it caused problems for Amanullah as well. So the same people that are telling us that Amanullah was a great nationalist icon left his own countrymen who fought for him at great risk on the other side to get his independence and his political victory. And that is unfortunately the way it is.
This particular incident after the declaration of independence is not really present in the national consciousness of Afghans, especially when you see there are even some videos, very early videos from those areas where they show that British airplanes would they carried out this campaign of scorched earth. They burned their villages, their cattle, everything. So they used brute force to punish these tribes for assisting Amanullah Khan in declaring his independence. While we see now in Afghanistan people often saying, yes, Laro Bariao Afghan and Manzoor Pashtun is an Afghan, etc., they don't really mention that.
And that's the thing, is that I don't disagree with Laro Bariao Afghan in the sense that Afghan meant something at a certain time. It still means something in our present time, and Manzoor Pashtun fits the bill. I don't have any problem with that. But, those people fought and died for an independence that we enjoyed.
Yes.
Right? And Nadir Khan was going around telling them, don't worry, guys, everything's going to be good. And even he was undercut by Amanullah. Right?
Yeah.
And he actually recognized the value that the Wazir and the Massoud brought to Afghanistan in terms of the defense that the Wazir and the Massoud could bring us, and just the fact that their natural position was not on that side of the line. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, what ifs of history, right?
Yeah, that's very unfortunate. You wrote the Durand Line was not the result of a treaty signed bilaterally, but an agreement between a ruler of one state and the representatives of another, requiring renewal upon the change of ruler. This would mean that the initial period of the line's validity was even shorter than 100 years alleged today. So what's the difference between a bilaterally signed agreement and one signed between a ruler and the representative of another one?
So, for example, when a treaty is signed, right, it doesn't require renewal. You see?
Yeah.
When a treaty is signed, it's signed between two states, in theory. Okay,
Yeah.
the two states sign a treaty, and according to how the government represents its people, because all governments claim to be representative, of course, but whether that's a pre-selected parliament or whatever, that's the theory. The Durand Line was signed by Abdul Rahman. And because it was signed by Abdul Rahman, it required subsequent confirmations, okay? Which was why, for example, in 1905, there was a British viceroy called Lord Curzon, and this guy's known as like the personification of British imperial hubris and just being aggressive and whatever. He nearly went to war with Afghanistan, and only in 1905, after he'd been dismissed from his post as viceroy, things cooled down, and Amir Habibullah Khan recognized the line as being the delineation of spheres of influence. And in 1919, there was the Treaty of Rawalpindi, which was in theory, once again, this was an actual treaty, but that was obviously upgraded. In 1921, there was the agreement that the two sides would inform each other about military operations in the tribal belt, okay? But it was also confirmed in 1930. Now, the question is, why does this agreement or this treaty need to be confirmed so many different times, right? Well, it means that it wasn't considered a permanent reality, and it was on that basis that Kabul in 1947 and 1949 said, well, there's been a change of government on the other side, there's a bit of a jump between sphere of influence and sovereignty. We need to have negotiations about this. And I said in my article, that's despite the fact that Kabul lacked the means to do anything about it, but theoretically, it possesses the right to say, we no longer recognize this. Because if Abdul Rahman to Habibullah was a change of government, British India to Pakistan is also a change of government.
Okay, very good point. Now, maybe some of these Afghan nationalists will still say, okay, he's not that bad. Okay, so there's the last quote that I wanted to discuss before we go into other criticisms. You wrote, access to sea would mean Kabul ruling vast swaths of Baloch territory, undermining by definition the credibility of Pan-Afghan Union. What do you mean by this?
So in 1947, Muhammad Hashim Khan, the same prime minister who viewed the Afridi as being suspiciously close with Hindu nationalists, he said that if an independent Pashtunistan couldn't be established, those provinces should join Afghanistan, and Afghanistan should get access to the sea, which is very essential. Which comes back to my central point that the Durand Line argument is about power. It's not even entirely about ethnic Afghan irredentism, because if Afghanistan gets sea access, it has to rule basically all of what we know as Balochistan, or large chunks of it. And those territories are territories that are not ethnically Afghan. They're inhabited by Baloch, which means that the argument that all Afghans or Pashtuns should exist in one state is undermined, because you're also laying claim to the state of the territories inhabited by Baloch. So there's an inherent contradiction there, and that's how I explained that the only thing that can make this make sense is that there's a desire for power.
Okay. You see here's the thing, is that according to the Afghan nationalist perspective, the Baloch are also Afghans, sort of, so they have to
culturally similar. Yeah. They may as well just join in.
Yeah. And without even consulting with the Baloch, people have decided that this is going to be what it is, we've basically covered a lot of terrain. We have to now move on to something that might be a little bit more controversial. There are different political trends, as you know, as you've discussed them. There are the Pashtun nationalists in Pakistan. You have the Pakistani nationalists, And then you have on this side of the Durand Line, you have the Afghan nationalists, Pashtun nationalists, and there are also non-Pashtuns who have their own views and ideas. Can you basically give me a description of what are their perspectives, different perspectives on the Durand Line?
Okay, so I'll start off with the Pakistani nationalists, or the Pakistani, I don't want to say it, but the Pakistani sort of nationalist viewpoint, okay, which is that the Amirs of Afghanistan signed these agreements, confirmed them multiple times, and on the basis of succession of states, for example, Pakistan succeeded the British Raj. The Durand Line is the legal, lawful boundary, and that is etched in stone, and it should never change. Now, this is very interesting because the Afghan nationalist viewpoint is, like we discussed, 100 years, or it should, this was signed with British India, not with Pakistan. But also, the Afghan nationalist viewpoint is that Pakistan is a continuation of the British Raj, okay? And that is a perspective that colors its hostility towards Pakistan because it's Britain 2.0, essentially, right? And obviously, a Pakistani nationalist be like, no, what the hell, like, we're Muslims, whatever. But if you're basing your argument on the fact that the succession of states and we're the successor state, then it makes total sense for an Afghan nationalist to be like, hey, this is just Britain 2.0. Do you see what I'm saying? So you can't have your cake and eat it as well. You can't have it both ways, right? And obviously, a lot of the sort of the Afghan nationalist talking points are rife in Pakistan as well, amongst people like Manzoor Pashtun of this is a line we were not consulted about, enforced and whatever about us, enforced on us, and 100 years and Laro Bariya Afghan, and we should all be in one state. That's essentially, so the Pashtun nationalists in Pakistan and the Pashtun nationalists in Afghanistan have basically the same viewpoint. And then you have the Afghan nationalist, I'd say, is distinguished from the Pashtun nationalist because it's a nationalism that's focused on building a national consciousness around Afghanistan as the modern state. So I could consider someone like Amrullah Saleh as an Afghan nationalist because he believes in this nation state and believes in it very strongly. He has overlaps with Pashtun nationalists, but there are some differences there. So someone that believes very strongly in the Afghan nation state as it is, I would say is an Afghan nationalist. And obviously you have the other ethno-nationalisms in Afghanistan that aren't, I wouldn't say, they're not really relevant to this kind of discussion.
Well, you see, Dr. Abdullah, not so long ago, in one of his statements, he said the border, he called the Durand Line a border, and there was a lot of backlash. People were saying, how dare you to say a border? And there are other people, like I think it was Latif Pedram, who is a Tajik ethno-nationalist. And he was also saying, basically, we have to recognize the line. This is the other side of Durand Line. This is Pakistan. So
the last that I heard from Dr. Latif Pedram was that Secretary Blinken's letter to Ashraf Ghani mentioned Sayaf. And why didn't he mention any other figures? This is blatant Pashtun favoritism. So that's just the extent to which these people. I mean, there is. But the thing with what I find ironic about Dr. Abdullah right now is that he was part of a government that would, if we were operating back then, would be, spewing the most anti-Pakistan vitriol to discredit us. And I mentioned it in the live stream. Muhammad Taimur Fahad Khan asked me, which stakeholders should Afghanistan engage with? And I said, well, there are some stakeholders that will ally and say anything to stay in power. And so Dr. Abdullah, who is apparently also a Nurzeh, or he identifies as one, that's the age we live in, is now also willing to accept the Durand Line as an international boundary. So, and obviously, I think people like Latif Pedram see the Durand Line issue, strictly speaking, through the lens of this is a sort of a Trojan horse to, reinstitute Pashtun supremacy in Afghanistan, and as such, it should be recognized, or to gain favor with some people in Rawalpindi and Islamabad, to enhance his own credibility and power. So, but I don't consider those to be sort of essential parts of the conversation, in my personal opinion.
Yeah, there is another issue that now that you mention it. On the other side of the Durand Line, there are also Hazaras in Quetta.
Yes.
There are Baloch on both sides of the Durand Line. We have, if you go to northern Afghanistan, we have the Amu River, which is a natural boundary. But on the other side of Amu River, there are Tajiks, there are Uzbek, there are Turkmen, Kyrgyz. Just like there are those ethnicities on this side of the, the natural boundary. So we could also say that the similar situation can be observed along the Afghan-Iran border. So why is it that Durand Line is such a hot topic, and why aren't we talking about reunification with Tajikistan or with Iran?
Well, I mean, I speak only for myself here because it should have become, I really pray it should have become glaringly obvious that I don't sort of identify myself as belonging to those camps that I described. I am all for the erasure or the de-emphasizing of our northern border and to see the Central Asian republics come back in their rightful space in a sort of a closer relationship, economic, cultural, commercial, religious, whatever. I am all for that, okay? So, it's a really good question. But I think what you're asking is, why is it more of a discussion in Afghanistan, the Durand Line? And, well, the truth is that, first of all, I mentioned that the Durand Line, because there's the issue of access to the sea, okay, which would entail ruling Baloch territory, we can deduce, right? We can deduce, this is deduction, that it's not solely an issue of Pashtuns need to be reunited with Pashtuns, and this is just a Pashtun issue, because the people at the time that initiated this standoff obviously didn't see it as such, because they were also talking about sea access. Do you see what I'm saying? So we can't reduce this all to ethnicity. Oh, well, the Pashtuns are just angry that their border, they're cut by a border. And obviously that border also cuts across Baloch as well. But at the same time, it needs to be mentioned that, for example, the Amu was agreed upon as a boundary by Ahmad Shah Durrani with the Amir of Bukhara in 1767. Okay? The boundary of Iran and Afghanistan was largely mediated by the British, which was also one of the reasons why Sher Ali was very annoyed with the British. But that boundary, there isn't much of an appetite to see Mashhad being taken over by a Durrani Empire again, or for Nishapur to be taken over. And that's because there's a stark religious difference there. The issue here is that Afghanistan, as we know it as a nation state, is the rump state of what was once an empire. And that empire was an Afghan empire, as in Afghan or a Pashtun empire. And for Afghanistan to reach its logical conclusion as a nation state, within the nation state paradigm, not having parts, not having areas like Peshawar, like Job, like Waziristan, like Bajawar, like all of these areas, not having those areas is seen as something that retards Afghanistan's development as a nation state. You see, because a nation state needs to have sort of an ethnic component and a basis to it. And those people, all of Afghanistan's rulers, despite their actions, have had some sort of affinity with those people. For example, Amir Abdul Rahman's grandmother was a Bangash. He had wives from the parts that we now know as Pashtunkhwa. Sher Ali's wife, the mother of Ayub Khan and Yaqub Khan, was a Mormand. Okay, so even though Afghan rulers couldn't actually exercise control over those tribes, they made sure to intermarry amongst them because there was a recognition that these are our people. You see, so that is why I would say that Afghanistan or Afghan rulers throughout the decades have always seen sort of the Durand Line as its main problem. Also, there's the fact that I mentioned the religious differences with Iran before. The cultural differences between us and the Central Asian republics, for example, very unfortunately, are pretty glaring, thanks to 7 decades of communism. So that border was much more rigidly enforced than the Durand Line, which was always a fluid sort of border. And the fact that Kabul failed in rallying Pashtuns on the other side of the border, or the Durand Line, was down to the fact that the line itself didn't matter in day-to-day life. And in trying to emphasize the line as a real border, I think it will further increase the politicization of it.
Great. Okay. Now, to round it up,
would you agree with that?
Well, I personally, I have very conflicting feelings and views with regards to the Durand Line. Maybe when we will have our podcast about Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, then we can talk about this, and then I can share my views about this issue as well. To round this up, one very important question is that, okay, so you have contextualized the whole Durand Line, it's how it came about, what happened after the agreement was signed. But what is going to happen now? What is the way forward? What is, in your opinion, a practical solution for this tension between Afghanistan and Pakistan?
So I think that this whole emphasis on, has Afghanistan recognized it or not recognized it, and does it see it as legitimate or illegitimate, I think this is total nonsense, right? And the reason that is that, let's say, for example, Ashraf Ghani tomorrow says, I recognize the Durand Line as a legitimate border. What does it actually do? Nothing, because Ashraf Ghani can still give support to PTM as he's alleged as doing, and he can still be very close with India. So what practical relevance does it have? None, because Afghanistan could recognize the Durand Line and the next day organize joint military drills with India. How does that solve anything? At the same time, Afghanistan could refuse to recognize the Durand Line and have very close relationship with Pakistan. So going forward, we need to focus less on does Afghanistan recognize or not recognize it, and we need to address the paradigm within which power of the two states can only be gained at each other's expense. Okay? Instead of power being inversely proportional, we need to create or try to create a framework in which both states can enhance their own power together, right? And one of the critiques I got of the article as well was, you've done this great job, but there's no way out. What the hell do we do? And my answer to that is that the whole point of the article was that it's meant to be a politically incorrect history of the Durand Line beyond nationalist fables. I'm not here to talk about exactly what we should do going forward. And what we should do going forward is obviously very conditional on what actually happens in Afghanistan in the following months and years. So it's very difficult to give specific advice and whatever. But this paradigm, this Durand Line, its whole signing is obsolete, because the Durand Line speaks about spheres of influence. Right now we're talking about sovereignty. The Durand Line was signed by colonialist power. Now it's Pakistan. This paradigm needs to change because if Pakistan could not coerce an official recognition of the Durand Line under the Taliban Emirates, that is a level of influence I really doubt it will have again. Okay? And trying to, let's say Pakistan decided to sanction Afghanistan and to recognize the line, what do you think that's going to cause on the ground level? So the obsession with the line's recognition, whatever, it doesn't mean anything. What needs to be done is meaningful action in which the two states are not always at each other's loggerheads, in which they can agree to sort of pool together their interests, their resources, or whatever. I referenced Amina Khan, who was a previous guest on our podcast. She wrote an article in which she said that the pooling of sovereignty in the tribal areas was actually an idea in the 1930s and the 1940s. And that's because both states, by virtue of their geography and their ethnography, have a vested interest in the tribal belt, right? Going all the way from Kunar to Helmand, right? So focusing on, the semantics of, the lack of recognition and that sort of thing, it's not really something I'm a fan of, and I don't think that we'll move forward by sticking to that model.
Just a final point that I would like to make is that we are being held hostage by obviously those in power in Pakistan who want to make their subjects believe that Afghanistan poses an existential threat to Pakistan's sovereignty by not recognizing the Durand Line. And for many Pakistanis, Afghanistan is like a sort of a boogeyman.
Yeah.
And we see educated Pakistanis, people who speak multiple languages, they still act and speak in a way where they are basically exposing their tendency to see Afghanistan as a boogeyman, while also saying, Majera, you came and you came to our country, we gave you food and whatnot. But then again, you see this tension where they feel sort of threatened by Afghanistan. And on the opposite side, we have had many rulers in Afghanistan over the course of many years who all made statements. They organized this Pashtunistan Day in Afghanistan, where all these festivities, and you see these symbolic wearing of red caps in Kabul by even Ashraf Ghani has been seen with a cap like that. The Speaker of the Afghan Senate, Muslim Yar, they are basically telling people we are supporters of oppressed Pashtuns on the other side of Durand Line, and Pakistan is an occupier, is an oppressor, is an evil state, and etc.
Khyber-Pakhtunkhwa.
Yes, and this is a narrative that serves people in power to basically deceive the masses. Yes. That's what's happening. There is no real concern for oppressed people, because if the people in power in Afghanistan really cared about the oppressed Pashtuns on the other side of the Durand Line, they would also be concerned with the killing of civilians that happens in Afghanistan by Afghanistan's various militias, foreign forces during air raids. They don't show concern for them, but they're very concerned.
You are generally Pashtun.
Exactly. But they're very concerned about Pashtuns on the other side of the Durand Line. And this is something that is very prevalent. It's very dominant. It's in the media. It's also in the academia. You see on social media how people behave. Like the book review of Farooq Hossain that we have published recently. It is a book. I think it's an ethnography where a British academic basically spent time with Afghan refugees in UK who are Afghans who have their families in Peshawar. Okay? So what I notice is that we see so many stories and so many lived experiences of people that are being affected by this narrative, these tensions and hostilities. And I would say I'm not saying we should let bygones be bygones and forget everything and bye. All of that stuff, I'm not in favor of that. I genuinely believe that the way forward is addressing these issues head on without falling in the trap of all these sentimental issues, because nobody's being served by this. And maybe this article is a very important first step in the right direction. And speaking of that, because it is such an important article, and because we have taken it upon ourselves to do this here at the Afghan Eye, we need to make sure that more people have access to this article. So we have a professional translator who's going to translate the article. Now, this translator is a professional, and it's not someone that we can just ask to spend his time translating our work. This translator needs to be paid. So just like our hosting needs to be paid, all the expenses that we make, they all need to be covered.
Accessing all of the material, the online journals, the private correspondence, that was all. It wasn't free.
Yeah. So we are making a lot of expenses in order to create content, bring you new insights, and help the political debates and discussions forward in a positive direction. And this requires a lot of effort from our side. Like Ahmed-Waleed Kakar spent 3 months just working on one article. So what we are doing here, it's something that we believe in. We are doing this because we think that it's necessary. And if you also believe that it's necessary, if you also value the content that is being produced by the Afghan Eye, I would say start becoming involved, become a patron, visit our Patreon page. It's www.patreon.com/AFGEYE. Or you can also make a donation directly via PayPal. That's www.paypal.me/AFGEYE. So those are the 2 ways that you can support us. You can also contact us, send us an email, info@afghaneye.org if you want to donate Bitcoin. You can buy our t-shirt, go to our Teespring page. And if there is any other way you want to be involved, if you want to spread the word, tell people about the Afghan Eye, please do that. Share our content. Make sure that you're subscribed to our YouTube channel. We have now 750 subscribers on YouTube. There are still a lot of people who visit our website. They read our articles. They share our...
Thousands of them.
Yeah, and we have all these people who view our videos, but they're not subscribed. So, guys, what's happening? Make sure that you subscribe to our channel. Comment to our... if you see any of our videos, write down a cheeky comment, and who knows, we can respond and start a discussion in the comment section. And obviously, if you have any questions, any suggestions, if you want to share your insights, please send us an email, info@afghaneye.org. So those are all the ways that you can support us, that you can become involved. On this note, I would like to end. Ahmed-Waleed Kakar, do you still have anything else to say?
Yeah, I mean, all I would say is it's related to what you said earlier, like the sentimentality. What I want people to take away from the article, I don't want them to agree with my article, right? That's not the point. The point is I want people to appreciate and understand how the Durand Line, how complex the circumstances in which the Durand Line came about, how complex those circumstances were. I mentioned the Afridis, I mentioned the Betanis, I mentioned the Turis. You can write whole dissertations on British relations with each of those tribes. The reasoning behind why I provided brief examples was to shatter this myth that everyone on the other side was uniformly opposed to British imperialism and they were all just sold out and whatever. And that bothers me, because even if you justify your national identity, and I see this a lot, by the way, amongst the Pashtuns in Pakistan, you have those that, for example, they just see Pakistan as the state they're in, and they're Pakistan ka matlab Islam, and they're Muslims, and they're Pakistanis, and Afghanistan is their brother. And then you have a sort of a subsection that are like, well, I'm Pakistani because Amir Abdul Rahman didn't support the 1897 tribal rebellion. And now if you asked me, Sangar, right, assuming I was full on Kandari, and you asked me, why are you Afghan, Ahmed-Waleed? And I told you, well, I'm Afghan because the British failed to split off Kandahar from Afghanistan, and now I'm Afghan, and yeah, that's why I'm not Pakistani, so screw Pakistan. Like, that's not me doing a service to Afghanistan. That's pretty crap, right? I meant to say I identify with the culture, the history, the whatever. And so if you're sat there likewise and you're saying, I'm Pakistani because, well, I was Afghan, and then Amir Abdul Rahman said this in 1897, and now I'm Pakistani, so screw you guys. You're not doing a service to your country. That's not what your national identity is supposed to be. That's actually pretty worrying, that you're identifying yourself not as what you are, but what you're not. That's just something that you mentioned sentimentality and like the naive sort of allegiances that people have. That's not a good way to identify yourself. If I was sort of the purveyor of a nationalism and I found out that one of my crowd think like that, I'd be like, bro, get the hell out of here, That's not the point. The point is you're meant to believe in the grand myth and the values and the language and the culture, not, oh, well, this ruler did this and now I'm Pakistan. Get the hell out of here. So, yeah, so that was a bit of a tangent. It's just something I thought of right now. But just before we conclude the podcast, Sangar, you forgot to ask me if people want to contact me, like how can they get to me, because that's what you're supposed to do with your guests,
Yeah, you're right. So, guys, if you want to reach out to Ahmed-Waleed Kakar, he is available on Twitter. What's your handle?
AW Sanzar. And Sanzar is, AW. So AWSANZAR.
Okay. And obviously, guys, you can email us info@afghaneye.org. On that note, thank you all for listening. Thank you all for watching. It's always a pleasure to create more podcasts. So soon, within a few days, we will work on our next project, next episode. Until then, thank you all and goodbye. Wassalam.